this cube here with its shader, with a texture, it has a texture that is wrapped around it in a quite peculiar way. And there is a way of changing how a texture is wrapped around a geometry. And that uses what is called UV mapping. And a UV map is a kind of relationship connection between different points on the geometry, like a corner, for example, and different parts of the texture, like this S shape here, for example. The relationship between the geometry and the texture is determined by the UV map. And by manipulating the UV map, I can move around the texture on top of the geometry. Under Window and UV Texture Editor, we have the UV Texture Editor. It looks like this. When I select a geometry, the UV map of that geometry is opened up in the UV Texture Editor. I can zoom in and out and so on, pan and so on, just as I do in an ordinary perspective view with Alt and the mouse buttons. And in order to manipulate this UV map, I right-click on the grid here and click on UV. After that, I can select and move different parts of the UV map. And by selecting them, and then with the ordinary move translation tools, WER on the keyboard, I can move the part of the UV map. I can scale them also, and so on. And by manipulating these UV map, I can decide on exactly where different parts of the texture should go. That is one way of working. Then it might be that the UV map is completely wrong, so you want a new UV map. And you can create a new UV map for this object. If I select the geometry, and this is not done for the shader, it is done for each geometry. So the UV map is something that is primarily connected to the geometry. Up here, if I go to the polygons part of Maya, here I have create UVs, and I have different kinds of mapping. Planar mapping means that it kind of projects the texture right on top of the geometry, as if it was projected by a projector. Cylindrical and spherical mapping wraps the texture around, and it works very well for spheres, of course. Automatic mapping tries to do what I already have here, a kind of T-shape for a cube, for example. And just in order to show the difference, I can select a spherical mapping. And I get a chance to adjust this spherical mapping. It is a half sphere from the start, but by sliding these parts here, I can make it a full sphere around. I can move it around in the UV map also, and as you see, it is different ways of applying the texture. And when I'm done, I click the select tool again, and when I create a new UV map, Maya automatically switches over to select by component type. So I have to go over to object type when I'm done in order to select the whole geometry again. So that is how that looks. If I want to go back to the original UV map, I can try to make an automatic mapping. And in this case it doesn't work that very well, actually, as you see. It depends on what I want to do, of course. So let's go back to the original UV map that we had, the standard one for a cube. As you see, I can do I can go back many steps in Maya with using Ctrl Z. There is a third way of working with the UV map, and that is to export the UV map to Photoshop. So I showed before how we can move the UV map in respect to the texture, and you can do it the vice versa also, that you have the UV map fixed and you move the texture instead. And that is what you can do in Photoshop then. If I select the geometry, right-click, go to UV, and select the whole UV map, so all the control vertices are highlighted in green. Then I can go to polygons and UV snapshot. And this exports a file as a JPEG, for example, and I can decide on the size of it. 256 pixels is a little bit small, so let's have 1024. That's a good size for a texture, and we can make it as a JPEG. Textures, I often keep my textures to square shapes, and I keep it to integers of 2 really. If you know the number sequence 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 124, 256, and so on, then you know that the next number in this sequence is 1024. And you can go up, and then you have 4096 and so on. And if you stick to those numbers, the rendering in Maya will be a little bit quicker, because otherwise Maya will need to rescale the images. It's just a % or so of the render time, but I usually stick to these sizes. Of course, if I really need another size, I do another size. Okay, I export this UV map, and let's see if that works. We should have the UV map on the hard drive. And here is the image. If I open this image here, the UV map image, if I open that one in Photoshop, you will see that here I have a graphical representation of the UV map, and here I can now paint on top of this UV map and place the parts of my texture in the right positions on the UV map. Then I save this JPEG as a texture. And in Maya, I replace the texture that I have from the start. I go into the shader, replace the texture. I have the texture here, and as you see in the window here on the geometry, the new texture is applied on top of the model.